This is a production of Cornell University.
First, big thanks to Matt Ellmore, Professor Ellmore at Rutgers University. I understand he's got a little one running around there, so we may get a visitor, which will be really cool for all of us, and to get on tape to show her when she's all grown up someday.
Right? Yeah. Right now, Sesame Street's
excellent,
keeping her entertained. We'll see though.
My heart goes out to everybody with kids. This is my mind one of the biggest challenges all you guys have, in addition to all the other challenges, is trying to explain it to young people. What's going on now. 1 year old, they just need you all the time, right, Matt?
Yeah. She's 20 months, so yeah. Yeah. Not a whole.
Anyway,
she does well. She's getting used to these webinars actually. So it used to be like the computer's like the forbidden fruit, right? But now it seems like she's getting more used to it, so maybe not quite as interesting anymore.
So great.
Yeah, so it's fun.
Glad to have you. Thanks for taking the time. So. Again, here we are. I don't know any other way to say this. I've been doing this. This is our sixth one now in 2 weeks. We do one for golf, one for lawn, and one lawn and grounds, and one for sports. And each one keeps evolving. The information keeps changing. It turns out it winds up being a really good thing to do. And again, for me to remind you of the value of the safety, right? We have to, everything we're doing here is keeping each other safe. The reason we're in this position is we want to keep each other safe. And so what I'm going to talk about is sort of strategic ways to think about taking care of your lawn and grounds, and how, if you're going to work, right? If you're going to work, what's essential? How do you determine it? And I would be remiss, again, if I didn't say we're doing this to keep people safe. And also when we work, we have to keep people safe. So the question that came up, and I thought happened yesterday, and this is an update from yesterday. It was updated apparently this morning at 6 a.m. that horticulture, while deemed non-essential, landscaping for maintenance and pest control purposes has been designated as essential. So I'm not an interpreter of these things, right? We could parse this out, but it seems to me that this provides an argument that lawn and landscape professionals can work. Okay, so let me leave it at that. That's what the government says as of today. There's the date. I'd encourage you to stay up to date at the Ag and Markets website. Of course, we have the Disaster Education Network through Cooperative Extension that I talked about last week, and you can watch the video of last week and learn more about that. All right, well, if you're going to work, right, what does the lawn and landscape industry say? Well, the Lawn and Landscape Industry and National Association of Landscape Professionals just last week, beginning of this week, published guidelines and guidance for business operations during this time. And as it should, it begins with talking about how you keep your people safe. And there's a lot of good resources for this, right? I would encourage you, if you're a manager of a business, running a business, a foreman for a crew, overseeing workers, overseeing employees, even if you are an employee, everybody should be mindful of these guidance documents. Everybody should be mindful of what's going on. The society as we know it on our planet is completely altered now for something we cannot see. That confuses us. And so it requires us to be as specific as possible about how to be safe. And that's why I think these kinds of industry-wide guidance documents are good places for everybody to start when they're trying to keep people safe. Now, what's going to happen is not everyone's going to be feeling comfortable coming to work. You might have a positive on your crew. And if you haven't split up your crews and you have common meeting places and you haven't demonstrated that these people aren't infected, there's going to be lots of quarantines and removals for periods of time until testing becomes more common. The Golf Course Superintendents of America have put together what I think is one of these emergency business documents. I didn't see it in others. This is the one I still think is a good place, but you have to have a response plan, right? What are you doing with your workers, right? If you're just going out and taking a couple of wipes and wiping things down, hoping for the best, I would not suggest hope as a viable strategy. I just don't think hope is going to be a viable strategy. So I think having a plan is always better. So I think there's lots of resources and additional burdens that a lot of managers have in lawn and landscape crews, because unlike golf and unlike sports, lawn and grounds management is a dispersed operation. You're dispersing people into a community, into a county, across state lines, driving trucks, right? I mean, we're talking about a much more complicated situation as we come to understand community spread of this virus and how rapidly things are going to get shut down if we don't take better care and follow some of these principles. So I think that's the end of my soapbox for that. Once you're going to decide what you're going to do, right? Again, the National Association of Landscape Professionals have done a nice job here in saying what's essential, right? Landscape professionals, here's what we do. This is what we do. We perform regular maintenance, prune to control weeds, essential treatments to reduce the spread of deadly diseases, ticks and fleas. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, right? So it's very clear if you look at these documents, what can be deemed essential. Now, I really like it. If you haven't been to this website, let me encourage you to do it. There's one of the other things, I mean, every industry's got to do it, right? Because we're managing our landscapes for people. Having a strategy for communicating with customers during this time is really important, right? They're not going to want to come out and talk to you. They may have some confusion about it, right? And there's going to be challenges you're going to face around this. So I'd encourage you to go to the National Association of Landscape Professionals. There's an article in there just published a couple of days ago. Really good tips and tidbits from people in the field. This is what we need more of. You guys, as a rule, are some of the most adaptive, problem-solving people I know. I mean, I think sometimes we get into ruts. We do things all the time, but I really see great responsiveness to what's happening. I hope we keep up, communicate with clients, communicate with workers as well, because you may see a reduction in your workforce over time, right? You may see people becoming uncomfortable coming to work. So having these abilities to have these conversations both with your clients, that their concerns about whether they're going to be able to keep up the service, and are you going to do enhancements or are you doing maintenance? What's it going to look like if you start installing a landscape during a pandemic? I think these kinds of things are strategizing. I think maybe it comes down to maintenance, and then it comes down to, okay, what am I going to do on my lawn? And then it comes down to what's going on. Well, in my mind, for most of you, if I was a lawn care professional, I'd be looking at 55 degrees soil temperature. If my soil's at 55 degrees soil temperature, I know things are beginning in earnest as far as my lawn's waking up and getting going, and I'm getting growth where I've really got to think about it. So if you use that as a measure, you know, in the New York metropolitan area, down where Matt is, we're pretty close, still in the low 50s, and you get wide variety of measurements. You can see as you get further north, the soils are upper 30s to upper 40s. All right, now air temperature wise, we use growing degree days, right? If you're not familiar with growing degree days, you can go to our forecast website. It's basically a way of seeing how we accumulate heat and how it advances. So, well, in general, much following like it's been for the last couple of growing seasons, we're ahead of normal to the south. So those of you in New York State, Long Island, down where Matt is, you're a little bit ahead of normal, and you see it's much ahead of normal as you get further south. And then all the white spaces, well, you know, we haven't accumulated enough to even know how far we are behind yet. But there's some sense we're behind. And so you see in the Hudson Valley still 21 to 14 days behind in some areas. And what is projected to happen going forward is that at least for the next few days, not much enhancement. We've got some cool weather, a little bit of rain, then some dry weather. We are expecting some above normal temperatures next week. So we will see some advancement in the coming week in the landscape, especially as you move to the south. All right, so again, where to start? First, I tell you, if you're not thinking about raising your mowing heights on your customers, I really believe you're making a mistake. I simply do not see any argument for not raising the mowing height. We're going to talk about ticks in a second, and I don't know again if Joe Ellen is here because we wanted to talk about weeds today. We talked about ticks last week. You can watch that videotape. But right now, there isn't any evidence we see any more or less ticks in grass that's mowed higher. There's no evidence we're going to see anything more or less. We don't have any data to indicate that. We have some data to indicate that regular mowing, staying away from the woodlot edges, works for keeping ticks down. So we do have some piece of information that some mowing keeps the ticks down. we'll talk about ticks more. But for sure, to reduce the amount of time you got to mow, the first thing you do is raise the height. I would tell you there isn't a lawn I can think of in the Northeast that can't tolerate going to 4 inches. Can't tolerate going to 4 inches. Now, we can have some arguments about some exceptions, but in general, I don't think you should start mowing until it's almost 6 inches. So I think we're a long way from 6 inches. Now, we can debate that. So how is it growing right now? Well, we've got average air temperatures in the upper 40s to low 50s. And if you look at this, you're still only at about 50% of how much growth you can get. And in general, you shouldn't be out there slinging fertilizer. I would not necessarily be out there slinging fertilizer unless Dr. Ellmore is going to tell me in a minute, a thin lawn and you don't want to put a pre down, maybe a fertilizer could help a thin lawn rather than putting a pre-emergent down. We'll have that conversation in a minute. But let me wrap up by talking about ticks. A recent paper was brought to our attention here at Cornell that indicated leaf litter building up along the edges of the landscape, something like this. Now, this is funny. I got a picture, pulled it off the internet about this pollinator habitat. But this kind of leaf litter along the edge there in this study has been shown to have a higher population of the black-legged ticks. Really a very interesting paper associated with public health in my mind in some ways. This study did not include mulch mowing. Ugh. I wish it would have included mulch mowing. It didn't. It just had removal and composting, removal and disposal, or leaving them there. And leaving them there in a situation like this always had a higher percentage, about 13 to 15% higher, especially along the edge where the habitat was very favorable. All right, let me wrap up and make our transition, make a transition to bringing Matt in here. First off, I've seen reports and seen some chickweed flowering, the winter annuals beginning to flower right along the curbside, but only where the heat is building up along the edge am I seeing it advance the most rapidly. And I'm also not seeing much germination yet of crabgrass, and I don't know we've got the soil temperatures, Matt, but now I wonder, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see you. Let's start with a simple conversation that I brought up earlier. One of the questions landscape professionals might be asking at this time is, well, when I get out, I put out my weed and feed, and I'm sure you know the mantra and the dance of the weed and feed that happens. So my question to you is, would you recommend maybe a little nitrogen if you've got a thin lawn, hold off on the pre because it still feels early? Where are you at for using nitrogen as an alternative to getting the pre out earlier?
As a complete alternative, I mean, I guess back up, I agree with you that it's a little early, especially, as you go farther north. I think, you showed those soil temperatures. I think what we're waiting on, at least in this region, is we're waiting on a few warm days in a row, 75 degrees, 80 degrees. We haven't really had that. We got a little bit of a tease that in early March, and that brought the forsythia to full bloom. So that's our indicator for crabgrass, or at least for getting your pre-emergence out. But I agree, if we stay in this cool weather pattern, it's not going to germinate for a while. I've only seen a little bit of crabgrass germinating in sidewalks, where it gets warm. I think, again, we're waiting for warm temperatures. So you're right. If now's a good time to put out nitrogen, you could definitely do that and then wait for your pre, maybe for some of you farther north, it might be 3 to 4 weeks. I guess it depends on the logistics of your business and, what we're doing, right? If you don't think you're going to be able to get back to a lawn for 6 weeks or so, you might want to go ahead and apply if you're using a pendimethalin or a prodiamine product. If you've got dithiopyr, you've got more flexibility there. So especially if you're using dithiopyr, like you said, Frank, you might be able to wait and put some nitrogen out now. And that is going to be really important to get that lawn, dense to try to outcompete weeds. We see it all the time. It's probably a dense lawn is just as powerful as any herbicide, and the two really need to work together. If you've got a thin lawn, the herbicides really aren't built to hold up over an entire season with a thin lawn. They're going to get you so far But you really do need that density. So if now's a good time to start building that density, if you've got some active growth, I would agree. Nitrogen is going to be a useful thing. So I guess delaying that pre is really maybe up to, again, logistics of your business and where you are. If you're up in New England where soil temperatures are still 30, we've got plenty of time. Again, here in Jersey, I think we're waiting on a few warm days in a row.
And I think so. Okay. So there's two things on my mind. There's the one thing that, sounds like they're saying I could just go out with weeded feed now because, Rossi says I need a little N. I might be a little bit early, but what if it gets bad in the New York metro area and they figure out they got to shut down, they got to keep everybody off, or worse, I got one guy, I need 15 guys to make applications.
Yep. Yeah.
How serious of we're going to get a front row seat to what happens when we don't use pre-emergent herbicides. Give me a worst case scenario. Let's say we couldn't get out there. Let's say they shut down mid next week and said you can't get out.
Yeah.
Or you don't have the workforce and you can't get out for a month. What's it going to look like when we get back into that landscape, Matt?
If it's a month, I mean, we'll have some weeds that start to emerge, but we still have a chance to maybe use some post-emergence herbicides or those kind of things to control them. If we get shut out and then we can't get back till July, that could be a problem where there's going to be a lot of weeds. So I guess if we do get shut out, trying to communicate with your customers that here's what to expect, but here's our plan for whenever we get back in business, what we're going to do. And you're going to have to that's like that, the density thing you mentioned is going to be important for if we get into a situation where we can't get onto these properties. That's going to definitely help in the summer. But the reality is that, nitrogen alone probably isn't going to cut it for everyone. If we get shut out, there's going to be weeds that come up. And depending on how long this goes, it might make it tougher to control things like crabgrass, especially if it goes on too long. If it's just a couple months, into June, crabgrass can be controlled pretty easily if it's small. But once it really gets big, that's when you get behind the 8 ball, I guess you could say, and it's hard. So
what about my higher mowing height? I mean, what if we do get the industry to say, listen, I was at 3, Rossi says 4. All right, what the hell? I only got a few guys. I can stripe up the lawn at 4, and listen, Matt, I'm of great hope that adaptations people make now to see what's minimal and essential sticks and becomes part of what we do on. And so I'm really pushing, hey, get it up to 4 inches.
Oh, yeah.
All right, I get a little bit with N, and now I can get a little bit more. Am I starting to get to the point where now you're feeling better if I got to wait longer by those 2 adaptations?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, increasing the mowing height is going to reduce crabgrass pressure, and good fertilization practices will too. So, hopefully, maybe some of these customers could be convinced that, hey, maybe this 4-inch mowing height isn't so bad. I don't have as many weeds, and that research has been done, to show that crabgrass infestations are not as bad if you increase the mowing height, especially if you can get to 4 inches. So it's for sure. And that'll delay the crabgrass germination a little bit too. It'll keep that soil temperature cooler. So anything to get turf density, height of cut, all good.
Sure. Hey, Matt, go ahead, so I've got a question that intersects, we're talking about the higher mowing height, and so that can give you some advantages with crabgrass control. A lot of people are going to be trying to get out here soon, especially in the northern areas of New York, to clean up. So there's all this leaf litter around the edges of the lawn. We just talked about ticks being more prevalent in the edges where there's leaf litter. Would it be too crazy to think, okay, we've got this leaf litter around, maybe we throw it in the lawn and mulch it up a little bit to provide some weed control? I know in the fall, that's kind of a good strategy, is to mulch those leaves into the lawn, and that kind of shades out the under canopy. In the spring, is that an option for people who maybe want to do a 2-for-1 thing? I don't want to really remove all this debris. Maybe I just spread it over the lawn and
I think so. I'm not aware of any research specifically addressing that. Maybe I'm just not missing something, but I think that definitely makes sense. I mean, there is some work to show that returning clippings to the lawn can reduce crabgrass, and the theory is that it's not only the nutrients you're returning, but actually those clippings are going to provide a light layer of mulch and shade that soil from crabgrass seedlings that need light to germinate. So that in theory, I think that's a great idea and maybe something to adopt. I guess the only thing to be careful with would be, if you put out too much leaf litter, that's going to tie up a bunch of nitrogen. So where that balance strikes is a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but that would be the only thing. Maybe you want to complement it with a nitrogen fertilizer application. But yeah, I think that would be a good adaptation for these times.
So there's old Michigan State work that showed, I think Ron Calhoun did it. They did the maple and oak leaf thing, and they found that some of the leaves reduced dandelion populations the way they were doing the mulching work. They also found that long-term, mulching the leaves into the lawn didn't really change soil properties in any meaningful way. But I do think this is important. You've shown, Matt, and I know we've wondered about this out loud, that there is some value to doing some smothering of that surface, right? You remember we had this question about bent grass and thatch and right. And I'm wondering, every year when we go out with this pre, I really come to believe that pre is, if you don't disturb the ground, the only thing that pre is really doing is preventing last year's seed rain from reestablishing. Because it seems to me over the season, the seed gets buried to a certain extent. What do you think?
Yeah. So you're talking about, I agree that pre's are going to, last year's seed are what those pre's are going to inhibit. You're talking about maybe seeds that get deposited on the lawn in like the summer or,
So every year, so the pre-emergents are dealing with the seed rain from last year.
Right. Yep. And they're going to hold up for 6-8 weeks. And then once you get to July, the pre's not really there anymore, probably, unless you're making split applications or doing something like that.
Have you seen the pressure bad enough lately to need split applications?
Yeah, we've summer of 2018 was bad. It was hot and rainy. I think it really, I just tell people it depends on, your history. If you've got a really dense lawn and you've never had any problems with a single application, you don't really, I wouldn't necessarily adopt a split application program. But if you have found, for example, in 2018 or maybe even last summer that, your pre wasn't holding up, you might want to think about that split application and also, try to improve some, the conditions for the turf to grow too. It just depends, especially in the mid-Atlantic. I think they're going to need more split applications. As you get farther north, the season is shorter. I don't know what kind of a season we're in for. It looked like it could be a long one, but now it's pretty, I think temperatures are, I haven't looked exactly, but more normal. So
listen, let me ask you one more question and then we'll go to some listener questions.
Sure.
One of the reasons I think a lot of people thinking their pre's are failing is now we're getting goosegrass, kailinga, stiltgrass, Poa trivialis.
Yeah.
I think we are now, you have really sounded the warning here to me, at least from a goosegrass perspective. And, I studied annual grassy weeds enough to have it in the back of my mind. And what you started to draw my attention to last year when we visited, now I see, he's sort of right about this. Where are we? Let's start with, do I have to worry about any of those things right now? Any of those goosegrass, kailinga, stilt, or Poa triv?
If you don't have it, I guess I wouldn't necessarily worry about it. It's one of those things where if they start to pop up, you want to make sure you know how to ID them. So I guess in terms of worrying about them, I would just, just be sure I know how to ID them. Like goosegrass, kailinga, and Poa trivialis. Those are, again, maybe relatively new weeds, especially goosegrass and kailinga. So I would just be sure you know how to identify them so that if they pop up, you can make the appropriate adjustments, because most of our pre-emergents are going to be a lot stronger on crabgrass than goosegrass. And then kailinga being a perennial weed, really we need to look at post-emergence herbicides and some of the cultural practices like, irrigation and drainage and that kind of thing.
And you've got great resources. The reason one of the things that's been so great having a weed scientist in the Northeast like you and Randy are the only two left, sort of, it seems to me.
Yeah.
And you're really the only one doing a hardcore turf stuff anymore. So you are saying a lot of these weeds are problems. Are any of them, stiltgrass is an invasive.
Yeah.
At what point is kailinga is not invasive? Because landscape professionals have at least some urgency around invasives. your resources help with identification and control, right?
Yes, yeah, for both goosegrass, crabgrass, and false green kalinga, we do have some fact sheets, Rutgers Cooperative Extension fact sheets that kind of go through a little bit about how to identify them and what to do to control them. There is a stiltgrass fact sheet as well from Rutgers. That is becoming more of a problem, and it seems like there's some stiltgrass biotypes that are, adapted to turf. I used to say, it may be along along forest edges and tree canopies and really shaded areas you see stiltgrass where you don't mow as much, or maybe, it's kind of a nuisance but not a huge problem. But I've seen it in full sun, biotypes that seem like they're more adapted to mowing than the stuff that's in the forest, the invasive that's in the forest canopy. So yeah, that's becoming a problem as well, and that's tricky to control because there aren't a lot of labeled products, and that one already germinated, so that's tricky. That it germinates when the soil temperatures are cooler than crabgrass. So I've seen stiltgrass come up already. Okay. So if you haven't put out your pre, you're looking at post-emergent herbicides, which there's not very many labeled. So tricky.
So how about winter annuals? The beautiful picture behind me is of chickweed. What is your winter? I mean, a lot of guys, again, maybe a limited crew, spot treating, they're going to see winter annuals now. What are you telling people about these kinds of weeds, henbit, chickweed, things like that?
Yeah. I mean, now would be a good time to treat if you want to treat, but, a lot of these things are already flowering maybe and putting out seeds. So you could just, choose to let them go. If that's an option, and just communicating with the customer and say, hey, these things are going to die out here as soon as it gets warm. I mean, henbit, that one's not going to last much longer than a month or two for most of us. And the chickweed will hang around a little longer, but unless the infestations are really severe, I don't know. Winter annuals, you might be able to put that lower on the priority list potentially, but there are lots of good herbicides available. And they're pretty easy to control as well. So it just depends on where you're at.
Are there any weeds we might have to worry more about if we mow at 4 inches that we didn't have to worry about? Are there some that can get a foothold? Like, again, a lot of people have bent grass in their lawn, a very difficult grass and also very crappy. That's the first thing that comes to my mind. What about other weeds that might actually like not such frequent mowing and could be a bit of a problem?
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that too much. I mean, things like orchard grass could be more of a problem. There's some of these pasture type weeds.
Poatriv,
right? You'd see maybe more in a pasture. Quackgrass and those types of things. A lot of them are perennials though. I mean, foxtail's another one that could get worse if we have higher mowing. It's always something, right? There's going to be some weed that's going to find a way to take advantage of any situation. So, I mean, in general, you're going to have fewer problems if you mow higher than if you mow lower. But yeah, there could be, a few weeds like that. I don't think, I would say those, maybe a little bit more foxtail. Again, an orchard grass is kind of out right now, and so is poatriv. Those could maybe get a little worse, along with the bent grass. But I think bent grass is more going to be, how wet is the property? Where are those poorly drained areas that might compete better there?
Okay. But, Carl, we got questions? You're muted.
There we go. So first question from Walt. We're talking about higher mowing heights, 4 inches. He's saying in his experience, fine fescue, especially if it's shaded and thin, if it gets to 3 inches, it'll start lodging. So maybe you could talk quickly, Frank, about certain species that might not look so great when you start get to higher mowing heights, or if they prevent some long-term issues.
Well, I'll certainly comment, but I know Matt Ellmore has a pretty front row seat to a lot of fine fescues down there at Rutgers as well. I'll tell you, certainly in thin shaded areas where the canopy's thin, when you raise the mowing height, it's going to have a very different appearance, and it is going to lodge. To be honest, the only thing that worries me about raising the height of cut is places where there's a predominant amount of older or inexpensive rye and bluegrasses that are then going to go to flower and then make the lawn stemmy. I worry about the lawns getting stemmy flower stalks in there as they dry as we get later. I actually see that as a much bigger problem than the lodging. because over time, again, if it's uniform, I don't know that lodging is that big of a deal. I think a lot of people are going to complain that they don't have mowers that can manage the vegetation if we get a growth surge. That to me is the bigger question. And that's why I started out with the thing with Matt about, okay, I want to feed it to get some density if I've got a thin lawn. But man, the last thing I want to do is put N on this thing now if I can't work regularly because I got a depleted staff or can't get on the road. So I think like with weeds that we were talking about with Matt, about adaptations we're going to make, and a weed may get an advantage and we're just going to have to be able to communicate it. I think the message is everybody is going to, if they're doing this smartly in my mind, they're going to notice changes in their landscape. I want, Matt, for you to tell me at this point, all things considered, how much should I worry about weeds, and should I worry about mowing and keeping people out of there? And you got time, and this is we go till July, August. It's a different deal, but a couple of months, don't be trigger fingered here. Yeah,
and I agree. I think if it hopefully it's just a couple months, and don't do anything crazy that you haven't done before. Don't decide, well, I'm gonna put out pre-emergent at 2x, or I'm gonna try this new herbicide I haven't used, or I'm gonna I think increasing the mowing height slightly, just do everything in small steps, and no big, crazy changes, because I don't, and even if you get a bad crabgrass infestation, if this goes on, I mean, you can always reseed in the fall and,
exactly right.
Reset everything. So,
exactly right. And that ain't the worst thing. If the crabgrass comes up and we come back in August and it hasn't flowered, and we've got widespread turf renovation going on, that's not actually the worst thing.
No,
right?
I mean,
that's not actually the worst thing.
Yep. So, I think that would be that's a good point. Don't get trigger happy and start experimenting with on large properties or on a large scale with things that you're not sure about or you haven't done before. So,
other questions, Carl?
Yeah, we got a great one from. I got one more from Dan Scheid. Really good question, and we've talked with Dan about this in the past. But he says, if you had a lawn and a routine program of annual pre-emergent, multiple annual fertilizations, herbicide applications, shouldn't turf stands be somewhat resilient to missing a spring app, especially if combined with higher mowing heights? So, and I think this gets into a little bit of the weed seed bank historical management kind of questions here.
Well, I think we have talked about that there is benefits from the two things we're talking about, maybe a little bit of increased density, higher mowing height. And I guess, Matt, the question is to you, do you think many previously well-maintained stands that you've had for a long time, 15, 20-year-old lawns, what if you miss all the spring apps? How bad is it you think it's likely to get?
Yeah, if you've got a well-maintained lawn, you might not be so bad. Now, typically, it's a little bit of a gamble, because if you've been putting pre-emergents on every year, you still may have a little bit of a seed bank that you don't know about because you've been applying pre's. And then if you decide not to make that application this year, and then you get into a labor shortage and you can't get to the property, you might get behind. So it's a bit of a gamble, but definitely it wouldn't be the craziest thing. Typically, you if you wanted to see, here we go. Outside. If you wanted to see, if you wanted to, try to back off the pre this year, you would typically want to do it in a year where you could get back to the property if crabgrass slips through, to make an application before we get to August and it's too late. But if you want to maybe take a bit of a gamble on some properties where you've had good turf density over the years,
and communicate,
you could definitely do it.
That's right. And communicate that. You could go to the customer and say, listen, I know, times are tough. My business is suffering too. We've done a pretty good job here. We think we can get by with this year, and hope you sign us up for next year, because we're keeping everybody safe. Right.
And maybe you tell them, communicate that, and maybe we're going to save you an application now or something like that. Yeah, it's all about communication, because crabgrass is not the end of the world, right?
No, there you go. Thanks. And that's a great way to end now that we've seen his beautiful daughter. Carl, are there any more questions?
Just one, and I think maybe it ties in there. Gary's asking about tenacity residual for crabgrass. Does that have some post-emergence I guess
Let's
if you
talk
strip
about tenacity, because it is one of those weird ones, Matt, we can seed into, but
Yep.
it has a really short window for pre and very little post activity when it's young, right?
Yep. Yeah, it has some decent post-emergence activity as long as the plants are maybe 1 or 2 tiller crabgrass plants, not much bigger than that. And the residual is not too long, maybe a few weeks in the middle of the summer or middle of the spring. A great option though if you've seeded in the fall or if you're going to seed this spring or something. But it is a potential option if you get out there. If we can't get out there till May or something like that.
Well, and so if Gary, I'm sure I know Gary's smart thinking about this. Okay, these guys just said, what if I can't get out there till July? I got crabgrass. Well, if it's 1 to 2 tillers, so we're going to monitor this. Maybe if we're locked down, Matt will come back and his daughter will join us again, and we'll say, okay, now you're here. If you can get in now, you can go with tenacity, knock down what's there, cut it back, and seed into it, and you're home free. In fact, it might even help you with some annual bluegrass. How is tenacity pre on annual bluegrass?
It's pretty good. I mean, it's really the only thing. It's actually labeled for pre-emergence annual bluegrass control. There's a lot of work looking at it for post-emergence. It's not labeled there. It is labeled. It depends on the density of the annual bluegrass seed bank. Sometimes it works very well. I'd say either way, you're going to need, if you're using it for pre-emergence annual bluegrass control in a fall seeding, you're going to want to plan on 2 or 3 applications. 1 at seeding, and then 1 4 weeks later, and then maybe even another one after that. So it's a good option, yeah, for sure. That's really, if you're looking at a pre-emergence herbicide, tenacity is best used for annual bluegrass, maybe more so than crabgrass. I'd only use it for crabgrass if I'm spring seeding, because that's your only option, really, because 2% is not really around too much anymore. So, but 2% is a good option as well for in the spring. Not going to be good for annual bluegrass in the fall.
Okay. All right. Well, we knocked out all the questions, Frank. So I think we'll wrap it up there today. Matt, thanks again for dropping by.
Thanks so much, Matt.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Good to see
Matt,
your daughter.
hey, thanks. Hey. Matt, thanks to your family as well. I know your wife is a healthcare worker. And
big shout out.
We hope she stays safe, and thanks for your family for all that. Again, everybody, thanks for joining. We'll be right back here next week, Friday, 10 a.m., same link. And of course, you'll be able to find this on a recording as well. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Stay safe, Matt.
Thanks. You too. Stay safe, everybody.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.